That's it.
You this little arrow here would show it's registering audio somewhere. I just don't know if it's that.
Meeting owl.
Oh yeah.
Meeting owl. So we're okay.
Yeah, looks like you've got the right
Okay.
output.
And then I'm going to put this up. Like that?
Yeah.
And they can see it.
If you have your, I think you might have to your screen shared and yeah.
All right. Is there video as well as audio? Or are we just speaking?
I think it is. Yeah, there's video from there as well.
Carlos, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Just wanted to make sure we were all set.
Yeah. Can you can hear me, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So and Emery and I are together here, and we are on the phone, but we're following the video here.
Okay. And can you see the PowerPoint? Is there a PowerPoint up, or is it just me and April?
I can see the PowerPoint, and Lavinia, I can hear April more clearly than I can hear you.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
You think we're good for a little bit?
I think so.
Just
Thank
call
you.
me or email me something. I'll be back with you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for our delayed start. This is my first webinar. I'm not sure.
It's my first too. Yeah.
So we were trying to make sure that everything was closed, captioned, and that we had everything up and working. If you requested closed captions, I have sent you an email that will allow you to access the closed captions on a separate web page if you would like, because there are times when we will take the PowerPoint down to show some additional documents. So we are going, you're going to notice over on this side that you have like a participants list and then a Zoom group chat. We're just going to ask that if you have additional questions, that you write those your questions in the group chat so that we can see them and have access to them and can bring them up as they seem appropriate. There is going to be a little bit of talking beforehand, but we largely want to spend most of our time answering your questions. So this is, again, what we're looking to do is, and we, again, like I said, want to make sure that we have opportunity for everybody to have their questions answered. We are extremely happy to have Carlos Gomez and Emery York from Portland Public Schools. Portland Public Schools implemented the Seal of Biliteracy last year. And so they have a lot of resources that may be helpful to you as you go to participate in the Seal of Biliteracy. And those documents can be found in the email that was sent to you. And we will be bringing up those documents as we're talking, as needed as we're talking. So you want to start, or should I? Okay. So the purpose of the Seal of Biliteracy is to provide high school graduates with the credentials that are accepted at post-secondary education, as well as within the workforce in Maine and beyond. The seal is also looks to publicly recognize those students at graduation who have demonstrated a high degree of skill in English and at least one other language. I just want to provide a brief overview of what school districts can expect from the state once their students have submitted their applications. And in a few minutes, Anne-Marie from Portland Public Schools is going to talk in more detail about what they did to manage the process and to test students. So once applications have been received at the state, and that deadline is now May 15th rather than May 1st. Once those scores have been verified and students have earned the seal of biliteracy, the school district is going to receive a letter from the state saying that the following students have earned the seal of biliteracy and that they should include the seal of biliteracy on the student's final transcript. They will also receive a letter that should be included in the final transcript when sent to colleges. Then the school will also receive seals to be placed on student diplomas, certificates, and the option of providing students with a ribbon or sash for their graduation robes. Students will also receive a letter stating that they have earned the seal of biliteracy and how they should use their seal of biliteracy in their post-secondary and workforce pursuits. It is up to the district to decide if they would like to recognize students at their senior award ceremony, graduation, or any other event associated with graduation. And when possible, somebody from the Department of Education can be on hand to award the certificates at district ceremonies. I want to just underline that it's very important that the phrase seal of biliteracy and the language that that student earned the seal for be included on the final transcript for students. Colleges will need to see those particular words in order to be able to award them college credit. And so we're trying to make their job, we're trying to make the process for students as seamless as possible by including it on their final transcript. So that being said, I'm going to introduce Carlos and Anne-Marie. Carlos is the Director of Language Development for Portland Public Schools, and Anne-Marie is a Spanish teacher and the World Language Acquisition Specialist for Portland Public Schools. So Carlos and Anne-Marie, it's all you.
Thank you. And just to check, Lavinia, my screen is just showing the agenda frame of the PowerPoint.
What would you like me to bring up? Do you want me to bring up the resources?
Not necessarily. I just we can talk through some recommendations that we, or some learnings that we've had. So I'm here with Anne-Marie Orth, who is our World Language Specialist, and we have been piloting some of this for the last 2 years, and our school board has been very supportive of world languages in general. And last year was our first year sort of doing a district-wide world language assessment with the seal of biliteracy in mind. So there are a lot of logistics involved in the testing. Most of our languages are being assessed through either the Apple or the Avant tests, but we do have some languages that are not included in those tests. So we'll talk a little bit about the 85–90% of students who are taking Apple and Avant. They're relatively affordable tests, anywhere between $20 and $50 to $70 per test. They're the best way, if you have a lot of students signing up, we found doing a Google form and a Google Classroom to communicate with students through teachers as the best way to do it. So maybe having a lead teacher at each school being the point person for those communications. So we can talk through a couple of more logistics, but you know, if you only have a handful of students, it's probably going to be easier. But if you have, you know, 10 or more, it gets a little tricky. So, you know, using technology to try and streamline as much of the registration processes as much as possible would be ideal. In terms of timing, I would say the earlier in the school year, the better. In terms of assessments, what we found last year is that we had a March 15th to March 30th test date for those exams. The turnaround is relatively quickly, 2 weeks or so. Oftentimes for reading and listening, maybe the turnaround was immediate. For the speaking and the writing, where other people had to assess, it would take a few more days. So, so say by early April, we had a sense of who attained what on those exams. And then there was a lot of record keeping, follow-up, communication with the students. So there were a lot of additional details that had to be taken care of after the test. You know, it's pushing up against April vacation. And then once we had our students squared away, we're looking at a May timeline to, you know, especially with the seniors that are graduating, it gets to be a busy time of the year. So, so with that learning in mind from last year, we encouraged this year students to do some fall testing. So especially first semester seniors or juniors that were ready to take the test in the fall, so by early November. And we also were contemplating a winter testing season. The good thing about Apple and Avant is you can test at any point in the school year. And our goal is to try and wrap it all up by the end of March to be able to send that information up to the Maine Department of Ed. So some, you know, some tips on timing and details for the more commonly assessed languages. And then there's some information about least commonly taught languages that we've had to do some improvising, which we can would love to get some feedback on and share some thoughts on that. But maybe unless Anne-Marie would like to add something about the Apple and Avant testing, we can pause there.
Something that I did learn about Apple versus Avant, this is a little detaily, but with the Apple, you can register a student and they're registered right away. Like if you know how to register a student, you can do it right there and they're registered. But the Avant test takes a little bit longer. Like it could take a few days. So you can like we would have a student show up for testing and for some reason they hadn't told us ahead of time they were coming, and we were able to put them in the system right away, but not so with Avant.
And one last thing that I would add around this is because the testing can happen at any point of the year, you know, I think school districts are in good shape to start talking about this with their students now. There might be some sample, are there sample questions? Or?
There are demos that students can get on and take, but not for all of the languages that are offered at Apple. Only like you can go on the main page and look and see. Like there weren't any demos for I mean, any practice tests for Japanese, for example, because that's a new Apple test this year.
So just to have them be familiar, it's similar to Access in a lot of ways, with reading, writing, listening, speaking section. They do take some bandwidth, and there's a lot of audio and video downloading. So having check with your technology folks to make sure that if you do test a lot of students, you might stagger it or make sure you have the bandwidth to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carlos and Anne-Marie, for giving us those lessons learned. And I'm sure that there will be some other questions as we kind of go through this. You had talked about less commonly known languages. I know that there has been a concern around like our Native American languages and how will those be represented, and something that is something that we are working with designated tribal leaders to kind of come to Native tribal educators to come to so that they're included in that conversation and can work to kind of develop like what that would look like. So as we get more information around our Native American languages, we will be making it available through the Maine Seal of Biliteracy page. So I want to, we talked a little bit about the testing. I do want to also kind of talk about like all the modes that Carlos was referring to and that are provided for testing. As you look at the Portland Public Schools documents, because they have done this for a year already, you'll notice that they have their cutoffs in the documents. And what we're looking for the languages that students are testing in is to make sure that they're intermediate mid in listening, reading, speaking, and writing. So they would need to be at intermediate mid for all of those modes. However, we also know that there are students that have not had an opportunity to develop literacy in languages because of the fact that they either, in Maine, we don't teach their language, or because they haven't, there may not be a written language, or they haven't had an opportunity to study that language as much as, like, say, the languages that we do offer here in the state. And so when that happens, there will be a section on the application that will allow students to apply for an exemption for reading and writing. And that opportunity to apply for exemption is for them to explain like why it is that they haven't had an opportunity to develop those skills. So I guess, April, do you want to speak a little bit to how this is going to work for ELL students? That was one of the questions that we had.
Sure. So English learners, current or former, will be able to apply for the seal in the same way that other students do, with the eligibility requirements that are listed on the Maine DOE website, with the exception, as Lavinia was talking about, of potentially being exempt from reading and writing domains, depending on their circumstances. So they may be able to demonstrate their proficiency in English through Access by reaching what Maine has considered proficient in English, which is 4.5. Or there are other ways that they can demonstrate their proficiency in English, such as through the SAT or through meeting ELA standards required for graduation, just as any other student might do. And then most of the languages that are spoken by Maine's English learners can be tested through the common assessments such as Apple or Avant. But if there are languages that aren't represented by those assessments, we will work together, Lavinia will work with students and their teachers to make sure that they find a way to appropriately measure their language skills in line with what the other assessments are measuring. So any student, regardless of the language that they're bringing to the table, should be able to apply and be eligible for the seal.
I think it's also, if you know, like, for instance, that for Somali, because there are large communities in several of our cities at this point, like if you know that you have students that are going to test in a language that is not tested by Apple or Avant, if you send me an email with those languages, that would help kind of allow us to be proactive in making sure that we can find a solution. And as I'm thinking about that, Carlos and Anne Marie, can you talk a little bit about how you went about finding your community specialists that have kind of helped you with those less commonly taught languages?
Sure. Luckily, in Portland, our multilingual office, we have parent community specialists, mostly formerly educators in their own country, that are our cultural and linguistic liaisons between the schools and the families and communities. So where possible, we worked with them to help get the word out around the seal of biliteracy. And also we had them help us find linguistic resources that once we explained sort of the ACTFL proficiency levels, once we explained a bit more about the goal of the seal of biliteracy, they helped us collect some written materials. In some cases, they may have made audio recordings, and in general, were helpful. So this is a great opportunity to sort of engage your multilingual communities, folks that have some expertise and that might have some resources. So that's one way that we tried to assess the less commonly taught languages. There, of course, are some languages and some communities that we haven't been able to find, that we're kind of spreading the word to university professors, to other states that may have a larger population of that particular language community. So we had to get a bit creative in who we could work with.
Thank you for sharing that, Carlos. And I think that's helpful because there are going to be some languages that we don't have something to develop for, and your resourcefulness and finding out who those people are in your community and beyond has definitely benefited your students. So at this point, we're gonna just kind of put up on the screen that if there are these current resources, the Google folder has been linked in the email where you got your Zoom link from. We will also be providing like this webinar and then kind of compiling the tips from Carlos and Anne Marie into a page to be linked to the main page. But and there's also this question mark if you look on the screen, and that's simply that if there is a need, like we can continue to create some resources and share resources. So as your school districts are kind of going through this process, if you're like, this would have been really, I've created this because it was really helpful for our district, you can help out a colleague by, sharing it with us, and we'll make sure that it gets shared. So I'm going to put down the sorry, this is the new webinar thing for me. Okay, sorry, I was trying to see what the questions were that might be, that people had written in, which is what I'm having trouble seeing right now.
Can I take notes for a second?
Sure.
Highlight it here.
It's just a few.
Perfect. Yeah, I think, as Medina, I think you're absolutely right that it is put in place to kind of recognize multicultural backgrounds, but it's also put in place to recognize those students who maybe don't have like that home language different than English, but have made a concerted effort to like learn another language, which is something that across the United States, Americans are struggling to do, but is a skill that is really important as we are looking at Maine being part of that global marketplace and global community. And we want to make sure that we're setting our kids up for success. Are there other questions that people have based on things that they've heard, or if their question hasn't been addressed? Excellent point, Carlos.
Can I just want to, since I just want to address one of the major obstacles that we faced in implementing the seal was communicating with students, because I quickly realized that they don't actually, or the students here don't really check their email. And that was actually the way we communicated with them through Google Classroom. So when we realized this, it was too late, and I ended up getting their phone numbers and texting students like to remind them. So one of my colleagues, Jen Lunt, actually told me about an app called Talking Points. And it's a way to use your computer to text students so you can get their numbers. And it's not like it's on your personal phone, but rather through your computer. And she said that is a really good way of communicating with students, since the young people email is like, it's out of date for them.
Yes.
So anything you put on, a Google Classroom, and if a student has joined that Google Classroom, they get an email, but they're not checking the email. So
thank you for saying that, Anne-Marie, because that is, I remember you mentioning that as we were preparing for this, and that is really important information, because if you're spending that money for students to show up and take a test, it would be good that they show up. We have that question from from Jennifer, saying how to decide which tests to give students, because there's so many choices. And I guess Anne-Marie and Carlos, can you speak a little bit about how Apple and Avant kind of came to be the tests that you use most frequently?
Yes, I would say that Apple and Avant were offered the most languages to assess. They are probably the more affordable options. The other thing that we liked about them is that they're relatively long tests. We had students because with the 4 domains take on average 2.5 hours, sometimes up to 4 hours to take the test. So we could pause and break it up over time. The writing section of Apple is the longest. the students can take any domain in any order. We found that it was 6 prompts, and each prompt added or requested up to 3 paragraphs of written language. So it was that part was a bit challenging for stamina-wise for our students.
Yeah, and proctoring.
And proctoring, yeah. We tried after school midweek. Students were a bit tired, long test. We found our students gave us feedback that Saturday mornings were a little bit more doable. Sometimes Saturday mornings turned into Saturday afternoons. So, yeah. So those 2 were the easiest to administer, had the most options. The AP exams are another option, costlier. It's only given once a year, late in the school year with results coming in over the summer. So that's challenging for seniors who want to graduate with the seal of biliteracy. Yeah.
This is another logistical thing, but it's really, really important for the Apple. There's actually 2 different forms of the test. There's Form A and Form B. And for the seal of biliteracy, it's Form B. So they're just more advanced prompts. It goes from low, like high novice to high advanced, instead of starting, like Form A is like low novice to mid, intermediate mid. So it's important that when you register students, you put Form B. And you'll figure it out, but it's an important piece of information.
And I think there's been quite a few questions, or we've been receiving quite a few questions about the AP exam, and like school districts wanting to use that AP exam, but wondering, with the deadline being in May, how is this going to happen? And so we at the state took that feedback, and what we're going to end up doing is we are going to end up opening up a window. We haven't decided on the dates exactly, but it will be during the summer after AP exams have been given out to districts. However, there are a couple of things that you want to be aware of as a school district if you choose to test for that AP exam, is that there isn't going to be any recognition for that student at graduation, because graduation is in June and AP exams don't come until afterwards, and then we still have to do our process here at the state. And you also want to check with your guidance counselors or whoever is doing that final transcript to find out whether, getting a letter from the state in August saying that the student has earned the seal of biliteracy, are they going to be willing to go back and redo a final transcript to get it out to schools so that those students can earn that, earn their post-secondary credit, or getting it to the student so that they can use that as part of their application when they're applying to the workforce. So there is going to be that window opening, but just those are the 2 considerations to have as to whether or not the AP is actually the exam that people choose. So we also have a couple of questions asking like, can students attempt to this exam prior to their senior year? And they absolutely can. And with the access scores, they can test at any time from within their high school career, right?
Well, if it's a current English learner that's an English learner during high school, if they reach proficiency at any point, that's completely acceptable. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're kind of going by that same thing for world language. However, they can apply until their senior year, and that's because some of the English requirements, if you look at the application that's on the Maine Seal of Biliteracy, it says that they need to be on track to graduate with their English requirements. And so that's something that won't necessarily be clear until senior year if they're going through that option for their English. But also for the simple fact that tracking that at your district is much easier than, we don't necessarily have the capacity to track that here at the department. And so we want to make sure that somebody that can, you know, remind a student to submit that application is kind of being aware of that. And Carlos and Anne Marie, can you clarify like what you guys do on your transcripts so that you are kind of earmarking those students that are on track to get the seal of biliteracy?
Sure. So Anne-Marie and I keep a spreadsheet with our information of students who have signed up for tests, who have taken tests, the results from their tests. So we keep track of that centrally, and periodically, once a semester essentially, or after each wave of testing that we do centrally, we send communications to our guidance counselors at our high schools, saying who has world language proficiency, essentially, and they at that point will mark through Infinite Campus. I believe it's 2 different tabs, the enrollments tab and the remarks tab, I think it is, where we've set up some options for seal of biliteracy, and then they can check off from a pull down menu proficient, and then they would write in the description of the language, so French, Spanish, Japanese, whatever it is, and then under the remarks tab, I believe it is again, they would put, if it's an underclassman, I would say on track for the seal of biliteracy, and then for seniors, or by the time that student gets to senior year, they would go back and change it to seal of biliteracy. Again, depending on their English requirements. So it's a little bit of record keeping centrally for us, as well as for the guidance counselors.
Thanks, Carlos. So I'll address Laura's question. She's asking, I'll clarify what I was saying earlier about English learners. She asked if English learners can apply earlier than world languages students. And the answer is no. Sorry if that wasn't clear before. Everyone applies during their senior year. But what I was referring to is that an English learner could use their access score to demonstrate their proficiency in English from any point during their high school career. So if they achieved proficiency on access in grade 9, they could use that to go towards their seal application.
And I would add that we found, or we've seen that many of our high school students are perhaps frustrated with having to take access exams, and that we were able to offer seal of biliteracy exams or world language proficiency exams, and sort of make it a celebration of languages and multiple ways to demonstrate language. And I think that resonates with some students to recognize the value of languages. So for those of you with high numbers of high school access test takers, this is a good way to kind of get that message out about that we're all language learners in some way.
So we had a question about whether or not independent schools could also partake in the seal of biliteracy, and they absolutely can. And I think the other thing, I had a similar question from a teacher that asked, you know, like, I know that there are people or students in my building that aren't currently taking, you know, my world language course, but I think that they could earn the seal of biliteracy. Can they also take the tests? And they absolutely can. So there is no requirement of students being enrolled in a world language test to be able to show their proficiency in that language. The idea is, again, to honor languages that are spoken at home and languages that students learn. The question here about how early in the senior year can students apply, they can apply at any point. The hard copy, right now we're only at a hard copy version. We're still working on getting the ability to apply online. But just know that there probably won't be a response until closer to the May deadline in terms of like processing those. But you know, if they are able to show their proficiency in 2 or more languages before that May 15th deadline, then by all means they can submit their application. So there's also this question about which carries more weight, seal of biliteracy or an AP world language score. Laura, if you want to unmute and kind of clarify like the context for the question, that might help us to be able to better answer that question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Laura.
Okay, sorry, it took me to figure out which button.
Welcome to the club.
Okay, so in my school, we have very few ELs and we have more world language people, okay? And so in order to make it equitable for both the ELs and the world languages, the goal of the administration is to have people take as many APs as possible. And so if these students are trying for this seal of biliteracy, then they may not take an AP test. And that is counterproductive to what I believe the administration is interested in. So I'm just asking sort of clarification questions in terms of what I think my administrator will ask me.
Okay. Yeah. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly that there's a push in your district and that the idea of the seal of biliteracy might prevent students from taking AP courses?
Yes.
Okay. So I can definitely understand that question and that concern. I think that the messaging, the reason that we're offering the seal of biliteracy is that it ties directly to the actual proficiency scale, which is what any employer is going to want to know, is like, how proficient are you in the language? Which is, the seal of biliteracy kind of bridges that gap between workforce as well as post-secondary. I think the question around like AP is not necessarily, the seal of biliteracy is not trying to take away from AP. Like, AP is one of those exams that students can take to get the seal of biliteracy. But there is also that sense of like the preparation to show like what you're able to do once you go into college, because the AP exam is a rigorous exam, one that is designed for students to show that they are college ready. So it's kind of 2 different aims.
I would also say that if anything, the seal of biliteracy coming into existence is likely going to increase the enrollment of students in AP language classes, because that's one way for them to reach that point of being at the intermediate mid-level where they could qualify for the seal. So I think hopefully as the word gets out about the seal of biliteracy, more students will, not fewer students will take AP language classes. Whether they end up taking the AP exam, that's another question, but I imagine most students who take an AP class will take the AP exam as well.
I think the timing is problematic also.
Which is why we're opening up that second window to kind of, to allow like those AP scores to count, so that there still can be that that opportunity for students that are taking the AP exam to get that seal of biliteracy. I think the question that you might want to ask in your district is whoever's responsible for creating that final transcript, like, is that going to work for their,
Okay,
are they be willing to do that final transcript in August?
thank you.
I would add,
ahead.
in looking at the two tests, the AP exam, at least in Spanish, is, I would say, academically more demanding in terms of the types of materials that students are asked to read and comment on. The Apple test in Spanish is thorough. I think it gives a good indication of what students can do in terms of reading, writing, listening, and speaking. But it's more practical language, still academic in nature, but more geared towards a high school student, where AP is probably more geared towards a university type of interaction. So I would say that these Apple tests are probably good preparation for that AP exam. And I think different schools, different universities will accept and give credit for either the Seal of Biliteracy or AP exams in different ways. So it depends on what the students' goals are post-secondary. University of Southern Maine has looked at the criteria that we've set for the Seal of Biliteracy, and they've offered to give up to 8 units of credit, I think level 101 and 102. A student that gets a 5 on an AP exam may, at a different college, test out of languages, whereas some universities might look at a 5 on an AP as simply not as credit, but as placement into their language program. So it depends on the school and the student's goals. But any way that you can get an outside objective measure of students' language proficiency with any one of these exams is just another point of data for students to adjust to.
Thanks, Carlos. So Elena has asked a question about whether a student who has not yet demonstrated proficiency through Access, but has earned an A in their senior ELA class, for example, whether that student might be eligible to earn the seal. And the answer is yes. The Access score is not the only way to demonstrate that a student has a high degree of skill in English. So a current or former English learner, well, it would be a current English learner, I guess, in this case, could demonstrate proficiency by meeting standards in ELA or by the SAT if possible.
So there is that question about, like, if it's common for universities to grant the credits for students with the seal. Carlos just talked about the University of Southern Maine. We are working with all of the University of Maine campuses to see if they can offer credits for those seals. We hope that there will be an announcement shortly about that. In terms of, like, private universities, as Carlos said, like, their policies, they vary from college to college, and so it would be in the best interest for that student to ask that question when they are arriving on campus to see whether or not they grant those credits. And we have about 9 minutes, and I want to give Anne-Marie, Carlos, April, and myself just a chance to kind of do some closing comments. So looking down to see, so yes, when we're talking about the AP exam, we're talking about the AP language and culture exam, although there's also the AP literature exam. Both of those would be fine for both English or for a world language that scores on both those exams.
Yeah, I was talking about the language and culture AP exam.
Mm-hmm. All right. Are there any questions? And I apologize if we missed one, but are there any urgent questions before we kind of give our final thoughts?
Okay.
All right.
In that case, you all have our contact information on the last slide of the presentation that you received, and you're welcome to reach out to Lavinia or to me with any questions as your students begin to apply for the seal. And one last note about any current or former English learners or any other student who has a primary or home language other than English, regardless of whether that student is an English learner. Some family outreach is probably going to go a long way to ensure that everybody is aware of the seal and that students really feel encouraged to go ahead and apply for it. So let me know if you would like any state resources around that parent outreach. I'd be happy to develop a flyer or whatever might be useful for you. So we can certainly talk about that. Feel free to send me an email or give me a call if that's something you'd be interested in.
Carlos and Anne-Marie, any final thoughts?
I just wanted to say that one of the reasons we had a lot of success with getting students to take the seal in the first place, especially ELLs, is that we had contacts at our high schools, like specific teachers that talked it up with the students. And we had a celebration at the end, and they received certificates and medals, and that was a big deal. So I think that was helpful in getting the word out and making sure we had lots of students this first go around.
And I would add that, think about how the Seal of Biliteracy might be able to promote world language study in your schools and school districts. It's something tangible, something that is recognizable in other settings, colleges, employment, in other states. And I would just close on looking back at that celebration that Anne-Marie just mentioned, and whether it was a student who came to us from another country speaking in their home language and learning English, or whether it was an English speaking student who spent years studying another language, the joy and the pride that they had when they sort of were recognized by somebody for their languages, a legitimate source, an Apple, Avant, AP, whatever it is, that if you could just capture that in a bottle, that would be your energy drink as an educator. So enjoy it, savor it, and promote it. It's a great thing.
Yes, absolutely. And my final thought is just to let you know that both April and I are here to help in any way that we can. So if there are additional questions or concerns as you're going through this process for the Seal of Biliteracy, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we will help any way that we can.
And thanks everyone who tuned in today. And if you have colleagues who couldn't be here, this webinar is going to be recorded. It has been recorded and will be archived. So please feel free to pass that along to them or send them our way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Sorry, now I feel like
How do we close everything?
let me close this one, right?
That's just the subtitle.
Yeah. Okay, I did stop sharing. All right, let's try again. Okay.
End meeting.